One of the common questions that my students ask me is, how do I tell if my essential oil is the real thing? And it is quite difficult if you're not familiar with the material to make a distinction between a quality product, something that's been adulterated, possibly with a synthetic, or just a really poor quality representation of that particular raw material. If I take an example of rose oil, or rose absolute in this particular case, something that I have recently come into a bit of a problem with regards to getting a good supply of rose absolute. So one of the main issues that you need to look at is obviously the quality of your supplier, and hopefully you've established a relationship with someone who you trust. That said, it is possible that that supplier may have gotten their hands on some material that is substandard, or they might be trying to pass off a synthetic or a cheap version on you. So it's good to know the difference. And I'm going to use rose as an example because it is one of the most commonly adulterated oils out there, because it's really popular and it's really expensive. So it makes sense to extend rose material by adding other things to it. So let's have a look at the colour that you'd expect to find with your rose absolute. It's not the Otto that we're talking about here, which will be clear and behaves a little bit differently. It's the rose absolute, so it's the solvent extracted rose. So if I'm taking my sample that I believe to be a good example of a quality product, it's going to look yellowy orange in the top. So if I put some on this little smelling strip, that's the sort of colour we'd be expecting for our rose absolute. Quite yellow, orangey. Yep. This is the suspect one, which is coming up with that pinky tinge I talked about earlier. And then it just turns clear. So if we compare the two, this is what I believe to be my synthetic or adulterated, and this is my good quality, authentic rose absolute. If we smell them, there is a difference, and obviously you need to smell the real thing to train yourself to detect if it is actually the right product. So you need to get your hands on the authentic product first and work with that material and familiarize yourself with it, so that when you do come across something that's not quite right, you can say, that's clearly not in my olfactory memory. Okay, this is the synthetic one, and it has a linear sort of quality to it in that it doesn't seem to change very much. And I have left this on a smelling strip for days just to see what happened, also with the colour, and it tends to remain the same experience all the way through. It's an overwhelming sweet, sickly tone. There is a rosy aspect to it, and I can see how some people that aren't familiar with the actual authentic material could say, well, that's a really nice rosy smell, but it's quite different. First of all, it's the linear aspect, and it's quite reminiscent of the cheap fragrance oils that you can pick up for a couple of bucks at some of your little homeware shops. And if you told me that it was a $3 oil, I'd believe you. So the two samples I have, this one, which claims to be a good rose Maroc, and this one, similarly, a rose Maroc. Now my issue with them is that one of them is a synthetic, and that's based on the feel and the consistency and obviously the smell. In this case, This is the one that I believe to be the true Rose Maroc. This is the one which is not. Slightly more thick when I move it around. This one has the distinctive yellowy reddish orange colour. This is slightly more pink, possibly a little hard to see with the calibration of this particular camera. When I feel it, it's slippery, but not overly oily. And obviously if you're smelling it, you'll find that there's quite a difference in the aroma. When I feel this one, it's got a lot more slip and it's a lot oilier, which is making me suspect it's been adulterated or it's not the real thing. The thing you can do to test if your oils are pure is to do an oil spot test. It may not show up on all oils, but for this one in particular, we're going to do a comparison with this Rose Maroc and see what happens when we put the oil onto a piece of paper. This is the one that I suspect is not the real thing. And we'll just pop that there and see what happens. And this is the one which is the real thing. And I know that because, first of all, I've used this product many times over years, so I know what it behaves like. I know the colour and I'm familiar with the aroma, and that has been a pretty good yardstick for me to measure other Rose Marocs or Damasks that I've purchased. This one is the new one, and I've tried it and I'm definitely not happy with it. So what we're getting here is a bit of a difference with the way it behaves on paper. This one immediately is creating quite a dark oil spot and the colour has changed, and this one, it's maintaining its deep yellow colour throughout. Obviously this is a measuring that you can do with Rose Maroc. We're not talking about Rose Otto, which is usually clear. Obviously with your roses, your absolutes, you're going to get some variation in the colour. It may be a deeper orange to a reddy orange, but it has a distinctive yellowish sort of tone to it. This one, slightly yellowish with a little bit of a pinkish apricot-y background, and it's looking quite different here in the oil spot test. This is the colour of the Rose Maroc that I'm suspecting is not the real thing, and this is the real one. So as a recap for you, some of the things that you can do to ensure that you're getting an authentic rose product is obviously to smell it, and hopefully you have gotten access to good quality material so that you can make a decision about whether or not you think it smells like the real thing. The second thing you need to look at is the colour. So as we saw earlier, that slightly pinkish tinge on the paper strip compared to the yellowy tinge that would be evident on your authentic rose. The other thing you can notice here is that it really started to bleed a lot. That was another thing that concerned me when I first started sort of testing it to see if it was the real thing. The other thing is texture. Now, your essential oils and absolutes are oil soluble. That doesn't mean that they are oily or leave an oily residue. They can leave a pigmentation or a colourful stain depending on what the product is. And in our case, our Rose Absolute left a slight yellowing. And this one here is the suspect Rose Absolute, which has actually left an oil spot, so an oily stain residue left behind. So that's the one that's not authentic, and this is the one that is. So I actually left this paper for 3 weeks to see what happened to that material, to see what happened, giving it a lengthy time of evaporation, just to make sure that it wasn't all in my head, and it actually has left behind this strange oil spot, which could mean that it also has been extended by a carrier oil. Now, I don't know, but it's definitely ringing alarm bells. So those are the 3 things you can do to just, check out to see if your rose is the real thing.